Tonight, we are joined by some remarkable women who are making history. First, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, an advocate, policymaker, activist, and a survivor. She was elected to Congress in 2018, where she represents Massachusetts' 7th Congressional District, the U.S. House of Representatives. Her election marked the first time Massachusetts had elected a person of color to represent us in Congress. She studied at Boston University and spent many years working for Senator John Kerry before in 2009 making history as the first woman of color to be elected to the Boston City Council. We're also joined this evening by Representative Nika Elugardo, a lawyer and longtime community advocate elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives also in 2018, where she represents the 15th Suffolk and Norfolk District, which includes the Boston neighborhoods of Jamaica Plain, Mission Hill, my neighborhood of Roslindale, and Brookline. She has degrees from MIT and Harvard and received her law degree from Boston University. She previously worked at the National Consumer Law Center as a legislative aide, research director, and director of an economic justice collaborative. We're also joined by Councilor Andrea Campbell, a lawyer who was elected to the Boston City Council in 2015, where she represents the neighborhoods of Mattapan, Dorchester, parts of Roslindale, and Jamaica Plain. In 2018, she also made history, becoming the first African-American woman to serve as City Council president. It's a hell of a year. She has worked in public and private sector legal counsel, including as deputy legal counsel to former Governor Deval Patrick. She's a graduate of the Boston Public Schools, a proud graduate of BPS, Princeton University, and holds a law degree from UCLA. These three incredible women were elected to their current roles in just these last 5 years. I will add, we are living in uncertain and for many traumatic times. And I just want to say personally, I feel tremendously privileged to wake up every day in a city where the names Ayanna, Nika, and Andrea are preceded by Congresswoman, Representative, and Counselor. Thank you all for your leadership. We are also delighted that today's discussion will be facilitated by Kimberly Atkins, a senior opinion writer with the Boston Globe and an MSNBC contributor. She was formerly a senior Washington News correspondent for WBUR. Kimberly is also a BU graduate, having received her law degree and master's in mass communication from the university. Over to you, Kimberly. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for that introduction. And thank you to our audience for joining us. We want you to be part of this conversation. So to submit a question, go to slido.com and use the event code BlackBoston, and we will get as many of your questions in during our discussion as we can. So I want to jump right in to this conversation with these remarkable women, Black women in Boston, and talk about what experiences inspired all of you to seek office. You clearly bring a different perspective. You all represent a lot of firsts that happen. And as Catherine said, these firsts have only happened in the past 5 years. So it shows how long it took to get change among our representatives in Boston and Massachusetts. But talk a little bit about what formed your desire to run for office in the first place. If I can start with Councilor Campbell, what made you want to run for office?
Well, first of all, thank you for hosting this conversation. And Catherine, thank you so much for those kind words. And Kimberly, it's so great to be with you. And of course, my sisters in service. It is an honor to be with them as well. I ran for office because of a story. Born and raised in the city of Boston, I say that proudly. And like Catherine said, a proud Boston Public Schools kid. And when I went to Princeton University, I was like, yes, I'm that public school kid from Boston, but decided to run for office after losing my twin brother, Andre. Andre, instead of realizing his God-given potential and graduating from a BPS high school and going off to college and fulfilling his dreams, instead cycled in and out of the criminal justice system and passed away while in the custody of the Department of Correction, which oversees our prisons here in Massachusetts, when he was only 29 years old. And he had a disease called scleroderma, which is an autoimmune disease, had been doing extremely well when he was outside. And then when he got arrested, was in custody for 2 years. And as a result of receiving inadequate health care, passed away while in that system. And I've had a lot of loss in my life. Both my biological parents are deceased. All of my biological grandparents are deceased as well under some tragic circumstances. But losing my twin brother hit differently. And so I asked really deep questions. What is my purpose? What am I meant to do with my gifts? I prayed a lot. I channeled that anger, that frustration into prayer, and I always name that, and decided to ultimately run and challenge a 32-year incumbent. And the rest, I guess, is sort of history. We built a movement of people who believed in me in that story, and unapologetically, taking Congresswoman Pressley's word, we shared that story. And we did it without any sense of shame. And I'm standing in that story, and it continues to fuel the work, which is how did two twins born and raised in the city of Boston have such different life outcomes? That is the question. That is the work. And so I fight every single day to dismantle systems that perpetuate inequities in this city. And I look forward to continuing to do that work. But it started with a story. And my brother continues to be my inspiration and my gives me that oomph, I guess I'll say, to exercise the courage to do this work every single day.
Well, Representative Elia Gardo, what about you? Talk about how your experiences moved you to seek public service.
Sure. Thank you, Kim. So good to see my sisters, Andrea and Ayanna, here today. Unlike Andrea, I was resistant even upon the first call to public service. When I came out of college, my mentor, Mel King, a city activist, said, "You should run for office." And I was deeply offended. I was more into protesting and had a very strong distaste for all things corporate, all things political, all things legal. Of course, I've done all those things now because you must recognize that where the seat of power is, that's where you need to be if you want to see change in social justice. But what really turned over my new leaf, so to speak, when I was in graduate school, much like Councilor Campbell, I was devoted deep in prayer. But my question to my God was, I want to be stretched in radical love and justice. I want to spread it more powerfully than anything I've done. And I was posing that question to a lot of my fellow students and challenging them. We even did a little class on it. And we had this homework. And in that homework, we were supposed to really try to listen and hear from the Holy Spirit. And people were learning to do that. For a lot of people, that was a very strange concept. And I said to God, in typical 29, 30-year-old, at least for me, obnoxiously arrogant fashion, you just try to stretch me. I want to be stretched, but I'm stretching so far and being as radical as I can. You can't even say anything that I would resist. And the words I heard were, "You should consider a career in politics." And I just had like the biggest internal temper tantrum that a person of that age could have. But part of the assignment was you had to receive something in that same week that would confirm what you had heard, and then have the courage to take action. And I was surrounded by these powerful women. I was volunteering for a program then called Women Waging Peace, with women working in conflict areas around the world as politicians. So Congo, Rwanda, the Philippines, Northern Ireland at that time, Palestine, Israel at that time, Colombia, all over the world, literally. And then, of course, some American stalwarts as well. And many of these women had been not only abused, but deeply violated by their government, sometimes in a quite literal way, sometimes in front of their children. Mm-hmm. And their response to that was to run for office. And I thought, wow, here I am, having the privilege to look down my nose at my own government when women here and around the world for generations have been taking this thing over. And so I had a couple of sort of supernatural experiences that same week. And there I was 15 years ago, deciding to prepare myself to run for office, and finally took the dive after Donald Trump got elected, to be honest. Everybody was like, "What are you waiting for? You can't prepare forever." So here I am.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. Congresswoman Pressley, talk about your journey.
Sure. Well, I think the three defining moments that sort of led to my ultimately making the decision to run for elected office in 2009. First is the house that I grew up in. My mother told me early on to be Black is a beautiful thing and something to be proud of, but that I was being born into a struggle. My coloring books were Black liberation flags. My mother did not read me traditional bedtime stories, conventional stories. She read me the speeches of Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm. And a parent is a child's first teacher. So my mom taught me early on her expectation, but also the power of movement building and civic engagement and voter participation. Fast forward, I was working 3 paid jobs to do an unpaid internship in the office of Congressman Joseph P. Kennedy II while a student at Boston University. And every day people were crossing the threshold of that office. And here I was at 19 years of age, able to pick up the phone and to intervene and to mitigate a foreclosure, a utility shutoff, to connect someone to a food pantry. And so I saw up close and personal the power of sort of that good government could play in people's lives, but I also was seeing the impact of policy because that was in 2003. And so many people were coming in facing foreclosure. And so that really crystallized for me the power of policy. And then finally, when I was an aide to Senator John Kerry, so I was an aide to John Kerry for 11 years, and then I was an aide to Congressman Kennedy for 4. But when I was an aide to Senator John Kerry, any organization dedicated to the safety, development, and wellness of women and girls, I volunteered for, or anything that was about gender parity in the corridors of power. So I served on boards and I volunteered, and I would give all these girls my cell phone number, and they would call me at all hours of the night. And I did everything I could to keep my home, my arms, and my heart open wide to them. But it was clear, based on the nature of their challenges, that we were failing them. And so there were 2 candidates on the Boston City Council, in Michael Flaherty and Sam Yoon, who were running for mayor. So that was opening up 2 seats, which is very rare. Yeah. And I said, ultimately, after a lot of prayer and meditation and a lot of cajoling, and I also want to say this, because this is a part that often gets left out, I cashed out my 401k in order to run. There's so much emphasis on the struggle to raise money once you're in a fight, but there's not a lot of transparency about the personal sacrifice and risk in every way. Not just scrutiny, not just racial tropes and sexism, but financially. I mean, it was a big gamble, but ultimately it was one that did pay off. But I ran on a platform to save our girls that didn't even know they needed saving, because I believe that we needed gender-specific and responsive programming, that was the job of government. And might I add that a lot of the people that folks told me I had to have coffee with and whose rings I had to kiss told me that I needed to go work in a nonprofit, that saving girls was not the work of municipal government.
Wow. Well, I want to talk about some of those barriers that you said, like financial sacrifice, especially in a place like Massachusetts, where politically there are a lot of smart, qualified, ambitious folks who are looking for opportunities to run for office. And there are more folks looking for those opportunities than there are open seats or even competitive seats. As you pointed out, these are rare opportunities. So the fields are often crowded and people hold on to office for a long period of time. And you end up with things like this most recent primary, where you have very popular people who did not win their race. So it's already tough enough. And then you have the additional obstacles as a Black woman, or as a Black person, or as a woman, or all of the above. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, all 3 of you have the experience of taking on incumbents, which is yet another obstacle. Representative Eliagardo, talk about, for somebody who didn't even think you were going to run for office, how those obstacles that you faced.
So we're so glad she did.
It was not for me the way that it was for people looking on. I didn't feel like a David and a Goliath situation at all. I felt like God called me to run for this specific office. People like Counselor Campbell helped me to think through, not what to do, but how to approach it and with what values. And I think I was the only person who it never occurred to me that I wouldn't win until, and I started early. So I ran for 1.5 years. And the first time I had the thought that I might not win was a little panic attack I had around 4:00 in the morning, the day of the election. And my daughter was here, and so a couple hours she came over, and we were singing praises and showering and putting on my makeup. And then I had forgotten all about that little panic attack within a couple hours. And it does come from my upbringing. I think, I was raised, from a demographic perspective, I had, was below poverty. My dad was a dealer. They were involved in all the wrong stuff. I was toted around the cocaine parties, et cetera. But I had so much love from those two parents, despite their substance use issues, and from my extended family and my church and my dad's extended family of really gangsters type of people. And
Andre, we're like, there's a lot of connective.
Yeah.
we're like both laughing in the background.
Yeah.
No, we know.
But it's systemic. That's the point. We're not anomalies. It is systemic.
And our stories are so common in our communities. That's right.
It's so common. Just like with Ayanna, when she mentioned the coloring books, my grandmother was a librarian at Martin Luther King branch. And after I had gone to 8 different schools and I was about to get kicked out of middle school, those I thought they were little old ladies, but when I think back, they were the age I am now, probably late 40s, because now they were in their 70s and 80s. So they helped me get straight, but also I went to Arambe Aruhu in the 2nd and 3rd grade summer schools where you are learning the Black national anthem and true Black history as American history. And so I grew up with a strong sense, both from my dad teaching me how to fight in the streets and from my faith, really understanding my power and really understanding that every single person has power that cannot be taken from them. And I'm sure we all have interesting stories about the journey of learning that, but that is the difference for me of being a Black woman, is that I do not have a choice as to whether or not I understand how to move power in a room. If I'm in this room that we're talking about right now, it's because I have learned that. And I feel very fortunate that I learned it as a baby, and very hopeful that, God has given me the grace to use it for good and not for evil, which does cross my mind even still from time to time. Because
so some other time we're going to find out. I do think this work is ministry in its own sort of manifestation and iteration, and I think we all share that. But I know that someone has told you there's an anointing and is wondering why you're not in the pulpit and why you're over here. But we're glad you are.
I worked in ministry, and I spent a lot of that couple of decades that I worked, for most of that in ministry, helping people understand how their work is ministry, whether they
That's right.
are home all day, unemployed,
That's right.
CEOs or artists, what have you. And so it would be difficult for people to say that to me if they had met me before this day.
So, Congresswoman Pressley, I want to ask you, because specifically, whether it's other races in Massachusetts or even beyond, when there are folks now who are challenging incumbents, they tell me that they are trying to run the Pressley playbook. I mean, you, by becoming the first Black woman elected to Congress from Massachusetts and winning a race against an incumbent, it's created a brand now. But for you, it wasn't just about deciding you were going to challenge an incumbent. It took a lot of work. I mean, talk about what went into it on the issues like money, fundraising, running from outside of the establishment. That was not easy.
Sure. Before I say that, because I was remiss to say it at the top, I want to thank Catherine. I want to thank you. And I want to just affirm that if you really believe that Black lives matter, then Black journalists matter. And we are so glad that you're on the editorial board, for the lens that you bring, for the stories that you tell, for the space that you hold. And so we're just grateful to be in virtual community with you one more time today to have this discussion.
Thank you.
I also just want to say that I'm very proud of the campaign that we ran, but I remember sitting in church and the pastor was talking about moments, movement, and momentum, and it would be easy for me to think that moments, movements, and momentum. It would be easy for me to just say, okay, we ushered in this new movement, but at the end of the day, I think we were in the momentum, because I count the election of Doris Bunty and Gloria Fox and Diane Wilkerson and Felix Arroyo and Sam Yoon and Chuck Turner and Charles Yen. I mean, I can't really approximate how long it takes a pebble to travel from the African diaspora to Chicago, to Boston, to Washington, D.C. But I'll just say I'm very proud of the campaign we ran, but I really was the beneficiary of ground that had been laid. And I want to underscore that, because I think oftentimes when we talk about heroes and trailblazers and ancestors, that we'll make it this really abstract, iconic thing. But it's actually it's not static, it's dynamic, it's all around us. And we need to be saying thank you. I also want to speak to the census. Everyone complete your census, because this seat and the opportunity to have proportional representation is about the census. And so here is a district that is 53% people of color, 40% foreign born, nearly 30% single female headed. And yet people still thought it audacious for me to run, when I had been, thanks to earning the trust and the confidence and the votes of the Boston electorate, the top vote getter for 3 consecutive elections, and 70% of the city of Boston is in the Massachusetts 7th. And on top of that, the incumbent had earned 23% of the vote 20 years ago and had gone unchallenged. And I really just felt the district deserved a choice. It wasn't me saying I'm better, or, it was just me simply saying, I think after 20 years, the district deserves a choice. The district has changed. The needs of the district have changed. These times demand a certain kind of activist leadership, which I seek to bring. But it was not an easy decision. And I want to end here by saying this, that even though I worked in politics for a long time, for many people, I belied an acceptable resume for who should be leading. This is a tribal, parochial place. I'm not from there. Catherine very appropriately said, I studied at Boston University. I did not graduate. Like many people, life got in the way for me. And I went to be a caregiver to my mother, to provide for my family. But I kept working and investing and building my community. But because when I ran, I was single, unmarried, childless, and this was an adopted home for me, and I didn't have a college degree, there were many people, despite all the toiling that I had done for the Democratic Party and in the offices of a congressman and a senator, who still believed I was not qualified.
Yeah, there is definitely, from covering politics out of Massachusetts for a long time, there is definitely a wait your turn mentality that happens with many candidates. Councillor Campbell, talk a little bit about that, those getting to where you are, some of those challenges.
Yeah, well, first of all, I changed backgrounds because I have a 3-year-old who wanted to be on this platform. And he was like, Mama, Mama.
A lot of people can understand what you're talking about.
That's right. So, it's all purpose driven for me. And it's all based in my spiritual faith, right? And so when I decided to run, most of the people I talked to said, don't even think about it. The person you're challenging, one, is a Black man, so how dare you? And I never made it about the person I was challenging. To this day, Counselor Yancey, I call him Counselor Yancey, and I refer to him as such, because I learned a long time ago that the elder Black folks in our community have been through a lot, and there's much we can learn from them. For me, similar to Congresswoman Pressley, it was about bringing a different lens, perspective, way of doing things, a different type of leadership, a different story, and a different background. But it was incredibly hard and challenging. And, you know, being a Black woman running is hard in itself to raise money, particularly if you do not come with a political background or don't have name recognition or not connected. It's also difficult, of course, when you challenge an incumbent, and it's also difficult when you challenge an incumbent of color. And so we found ourselves in looking to bring a new perspective, a new story, to also say, but we are still respectful of who was there. We are still respectful of our community. So it was navigating a very different conversation about what does it mean to have multiple people of color, particularly multiple Black people running for office all at the same time. I think we create the spaces. I think there's no limitation on all of the places we should be in this work. I think, if anything, I say we need more of the unusual suspects to run for office, those who have never envisioned running for office, those who are doing meaningful work in our community but want to take it to the next level. Similar to the Congresswoman, you've been doing work with young girls or young boys or in the trans community or on certain issues related to immigration. This political arena matters to your work. And if you feel called to do it, then go for it. And so it was it was at moments painful, but it was also glorious and so amazing, because the folks I met who had never engaged with the political system before, we were able to mobilize. That's a beautiful thing, and we need that in communities of color. It was also an opportunity for me to learn a great deal about myself and to grow. I think folks don't often talk about when we take on these endeavors, yes, they're hard, but they're opportunities for us to grow. And I will tell you, yes, you know, folks suggest we wait our turn. I don't think we can't wait anymore. You know, if we truly want these systems, including the political system, to be reflective of the demographics in the city of Boston, where I'm born and raised, then we have to think about how we encourage and support those who are different, who look different, but who reflect that demographic to take this on. And one thing I will say, I take tremendous pride in being from Boston. Tremendous pride. It's embedded in you. But I do also recognize that we have to do better in sort of this conversation around who belongs here, who this city belongs to. And I think folks hint on that. It's a big piece of the work too, in Boston in particular, not just the issues of inequity, race and racism, but that too. And I think how I talked about who this city belongs to in my race had a lot of folks be encouraged by that, which was another reason I think to support my initial candidacy when coming to the council. And that too felt really good to me.
And that's an important point. I mean, I say that also as somebody who considers Boston my adopted hometown. I'm originally from Detroit, but I lived in Boston and it became my home, JP, so it was in all of your districts. I want to talk about the pipeline, you know, something that we've already hinted at. You know, I remember Representative Eliagardo when I covered the State House. Not only were there not many people of color in the body itself, but there were not many staffers of color. It was very, very lopsided, and that is changing. But talk about how things like staff, how the people around you make a pipeline for people who are not the traditional candidates to try to run for office, or even if they're not running for office. I mean, other people, everyone in that building has a role to play. What was that like for you, and who served as your mentor to encourage you to go?
Right. Well, first I need to give a big shout out to Beacon Block, which if you have not heard of these powerful young Black staffers
Mark, Kara,
at the State House to not only articulate, but also demonstrate what anti-racism looks like and does not look like and to make not only demands, but to also offer very clear solutions that they are part of, creative solutions, common sense solutions, the whole range. And I'm just very proud of people like Maya Rayner and the new executive director, actually, of the Black and Latino Caucus, Kayera, is another leader there, and there are a number of just phenomenal folks. My own staffer is a very young woman of color, came to me before I think she was even 22 years old, straight out of college. And I myself was a Black staffer for Senator Sonia Ching Diaz, very briefly, about 10 plus years ago or something like that. But I actually came into the State House as part of my preparation because, as I mentioned, about 15 years ago, I decided to run. And a woman plucked me up, a former ambassador and a white woman of enormous wealth at the time. And she said to me, this was part of that supernatural piece I had made reference to earlier, the day after my prayer, she said to me, you know, I think you should be a world leader. And she said that because I had said something really obnoxious to her in the classroom about how her experience, she's trying to teach us how to be active in geopolitical dynamics. She's talking about flying all over the world, doing this and that. And she puts her 10 things on the board and says, if you do these 10 things, you too, women in this class, you women can also change geopolitical dynamics as I have. I was not an ambassador when I did these things. And I raised my hand, and she'd be fine with me saying her name, Ambassador Hunt. Her name is Swanee Hunt.
We all knew who it was.
Right.
I didn't know her at the time. I didn't know she was wealthy or any of that. And I said, Ambassador Hunt, who was bankrolling your flights? I mean, you're going all over the world and you're skipping that part in your tips. And she said, oh, I'm independently wealthy. And I said, so what you're telling me is if I'm independently wealthy and I do the 10 things on the board, I can change geopolitical dynamics. Well, I think everybody in the class knew that, and you could probably drop the 10 things. And, you know, if you have that much money, and I wasn't even trying to be obnoxious, it kind of flew out of my mouth before I understood that it was also a critique perhaps on her, but she did not take it that way. And she sort of tried to take me under her wing, but when I went to go work for her after graduating, it lasted 4 months, not because of her, but because I could not stand the Democratic Party. And it wasn't just that we didn't have role models of color. It was that the people who were making power plays were not those people. They were people that I could not relate to, not because of their politics, not because of their intellectual understanding of poverty or lack thereof, but because of even stuff like that. Like, what are you talking about? Like, that has nothing to do with me, you flying all over the world. And the State House is very similar, except add to that active antagonism, which I have to say I did not experience. I put my head down. I hardly came out of Sonia Ching Diaz's office. And she is a woman of color. So I didn't know anything about what other people were doing and didn't care in my months there. But I have become aware of the deep-seated racism there. And so it's very important to find mentors, not only who can sort of provide networking, which is something that people think about, but also they can provide you with that courage and that understanding of your power. And that person might be somebody who lives on the street, in my experience, or it might be a grandmother, or it might be a politician. But I a little bit resist the idea that, because that's not how I experienced it, that you need a political mentor. Now, maybe I'm being a little bit blind to my own experience, because as I said, Mel King was the first person out there telling me to run. And so maybe unbeknownst to myself, I did have a political mentor that whole time, even though I didn't receive that from him. But I think what we really need is anybody who makes us understand that we have that power and we can do it.
Kimberly,
I just want to pause just for a moment, just to remind our audience, if you have a question, you can go to slido.com and use the event code Black Boston. Congresswoman, go ahead.
Thank you, Kimberly. You were talking about pipelines. So I do just want to acknowledge like the extraordinary work of Emerge Massachusetts. I was a founding board member. Their track record in terms of their recruitment, their training, and their election of women of color. I mean, this is one of the most successful affiliates in the country when it comes to Emerge. And so they have been unapologetic in, yes, gender parity and leadership matters, but, you know, we are going to be unapologetic in electing as many women of color, you know, as well. And I also like that it's intergenerational, because again, I think we have these very finite narratives about the profile of who should run. And, you know, that needs to be diversified. That needs to be challenged. When I said that I was single, unmarried, and childless, that wasn't true when I ran for Congress, but it was true when I ran for the city council. And there were many people, women in particular, who said, because you did not grow up in this public school system, because you do not have children in this public school system, because you don't have children at all, I don't think that you can relate to my life and my struggle. And I'm like, well, okay, well, wait a minute. I've purchased my first home. You know, I'm carrying that mortgage alone. I am running for office. There's no one to carry me on their insurance. I just quit my job. I'm a caregiver to my mother. And, you know, I see all the children as our children, right? So this isn't about, and the problems that face this urban school district exist throughout the country, because these are systemic, pervasive challenges. And so, you know, I came up with a little joke where I would say, well, how about I'm going to be married to my mission, and you can be my baby, you know? And so if that's so important, so I want to give a shout out to Emerge, the work of the Mass Women's Political Caucus. But I also want to say this: if internships are meant to be the pipeline, we should not be applauding the fact that I was working 3 paid jobs to do an unpaid internship. Pay your interns. And also, when we're talking about the pipeline, we pay our interns here a living wage, that we need to dismantle the white male consultant industrial complex. And I am serious about that. You know, this can't just be about diversifying who's running. We have to build the bench of people that know how to, you know, write a field plan, write a comm strategy, write policy, know how to raise money. And I also want people to know that your only options for civic engagement are not running for office and voting, or being on the front line with a bullhorn. You know, being an aide is an incredibly rewarding, purposeful, meaningful experience, even when we are in environments that are anti-Black. It's still important for us to hold that space.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you pointed to that point, Congresswoman, about what other people can do, because one question we do have from our audience, it is, what can a large population, I'm looking at the wrong ones. It says, what more can we do? What can progressive philanthropy do to fund and foster more progressive people of color and leaders in organizations? What can members of the public do if they do not want to run for office, but they want to participate in this change? They want to participate in the representation of Boston and Massachusetts, looking more like the people in Boston and Massachusetts. And I'll start with you, Councilor Campbell.
Well, you know, specifically on supporting more women and sort of women of color running for office. And then, of course, when we get here, supporting us, fund us, right? You know, whether we like it or not, in order to be successful in a campaign in this time, in this political game, frankly, you got to raise money. So we need folks to fund us. We need folks to fund candidates. But in addition to funding, volunteer in a campaign. You know, I would not have been successful in my race if people did not show up. And we had so many folks who volunteered for the first time, who said, I have never door knocked, called anybody, but I believe in what you're trying to do, and I want people in my street to know about you. So I'm going to help out. Where do I show up? And you can learn a great deal. And we had every demographic you can imagine. So in that campaign, we created a community, oftentimes when community doesn't exist in the very district you're running in, right? So it's really powerful. Show up at a counselor's office, right? My office, an elected's office, and say, you know, I want to work on this particular policy. I want to help you think through ideas. We don't have a lot of, you know, I have an incredible team. I do not do this work without my incredible team. But we are short-staffed often when we're thinking about trying to put forth policy and ideas. And by the grace of God, we have folks willing to volunteer their expertise, their thought leadership, help us craft legislation, review and research various things. So that expertise is critically important. And then, of course, we work in partnership. I work in partnership with civic leaders on the ground. I work in partnership with organizations. There's a whole host that are always looking for the same type of resources we're looking for, whether it's monetary, human capital, talent, all of that. There are numerous ways to get involved. And if you contact any of our offices, we can tell you specifics. And I just want to push back a little bit, progressive philanthropy, progressive causes. I'm very careful with sort of the labels, right? The end of the day, if you are in the philanthropy space and that's the space you're in, there are a whole host of ways you can show up and to support whatever we're attempting to do on the ground. If you want to support specifically women of color, there's a whole host of ways to do that, whether in politics, in the philanthropic space, the nonprofit space, private sector, you name it. Everyone has a role to play. It's just a question of how and what, and we have specific ways you can do that.
So I want to talk now. We've talked a lot about, running for office and getting the job and what it means and how people can help. I want to talk about the job, the job of action that you all hold in doing that, and how your work directly when it comes to policy, as well as the other parts of your job. We mentioned that it's part clergy, it's part all kinds of things. It's not just about passing laws and enforcing them, but talk about those policies. I mean, I've talked to you all in my job about everything from maternal health care to disparate discipline of Black girls in schools to any number of things that are impacting Boston, the census and that's impacting Boston in particular in these communities that you represent, but also it serves as a microcosm for what the country is dealing with right now. I'll start with Representative Eligardo. Talk about the work and what that means for communities of color in Boston and beyond.
I will. I do want to touch on just one thought that I think gets overlooked in the previous question. Yes, fund us, but also find us. Spend time in the ghetto, spend time in working class Black neighborhoods, spend time in majority Black and brown schools of every level, including higher ed, but also middle schools and high schools. Spend time in the communities where you want to see people rising up and taking power, political power. Yes, rich white lady or whoever is asking the question, I'm a political philanthropist. And a lot of Black people who have been rich for a long time have this problem as well. Come into our communities, you will notice who has this innate ability to lead in a very political way. And if you are spending time with those people, you will call them out as I was called out. And I was called out by more people than called me into political leadership. But those voices, those Mels, those Sonia Ching Diaz's, those Swanees, they took what I already had learned about myself and helped to shape it so that I could see myself in politics. And so we need you to show up before you give the dollar and put some of those dollars, invest them in some of the policies we're about to talk about right now in terms of how they operate on the ground. Show up in the schools that don't have enough money and give them money to get the books, to make sure they can hire the nurses, to make sure they can hire the social workers. Show up in public housing developments and ask, what do you need? I've challenged my district to do this, talk about the work. My people need diapers, district. You know what my district said to me in community meetings, neighbors? I could buy diapers every week. Who needs them? Tell me. I said, our people need food. The pandemic hit. Set up a Venmo account. One of my neighbors raised thousands of dollars in 4 days for our seniors who needed food. So I live in a district that has a lot of wealth. I'm one of two state reps coming in. Now it's all changing with new people coming in this new season. But when I came in, two of the state reps of color that represent majority white districts. And also many of the people of color in my district are also gentrifiers like myself. And so give back to people who have invested their lives in making this community the one that we now live in and love. And so it doesn't even have to be in politics, because all of our life is political. And so if you're about housing, if you're about climate change, if you're about education, get into the places where those things are happening on the ground and lift up students of color. When I was 17 protesting environmental injustice, I was literally one person. I was usually the only person of my age that I knew that was even saying that. I'm walking around trying to, in our public housing development, trying to get people to sign on to a petition. They wouldn't even sign for fear of rocking the boat and losing their housing. Here I am, 25 years later, and these young people are coming out of Brookline and wealthy parts of my district, mostly white kids, some kids of color, but very few Black children. And they're leading these movements, and they're in tears besides themselves trying to figure out how can we get more Black kids involved. That kind of pain needs to be felt by every white adult as well. Showing up at those schools, saying, what can we do with the issues that you have? And so we've done some of that work in my life, before becoming an elected official, where you help kids in public housing developments understand how the world heating up affects their lives, affects their crime statistics, affects their elders. And you know what happens? They get political because you're there, you're showing up. And so the last question and this question we're on right now are deeply integrated. Everybody likes to hear me talk about my leftist policies, and you can hear me talk about them in any setting. But on Black Boston, changing the face of whatever it is, I can't see the ... What are we changing the face of politics, probably, or the political landscape? I want to talk about you showing up in the community and you being political in the way my ancestors were political because they didn't have access. You get down there with them and do that same work. And we will see our young people rising up, and we are already seeing that, and older people as well. I don't want to make it sound like you have to be a young person of color to come up in this place, because we need our elder voices in politics too.
I just want to chime in. I just want to build on what Nika was saying. All of us could talk about a whole host of issues, all grounded in probably the inequities we see in the work we do every single day, the persistent inequities in housing, education, healthcare, access to green space, environmental justice, the arts. I mean, the list is long. And this is why I love working with these particular sisters, right? Understand that the foundation of those inequities continue to persist in our neighborhood and be exacerbated by COVID-19 is because of race and racism and structural racism. Yes. But the thing that I think Nika was hitting on that is critically important, and that I think is really important from even the city side, the council side, the administration side, is this idea of what it means for folks to get proximate to these problems, right? I often say, my biggest neighborhoods are Dorchester and Mattapan. It is where every inequity you could ever imagine, and probably some we've never even thought about, exist. And it's not just clear from the data, it's clear from the research, it's clear from the stories, it's clear from all our hearings, all the reports. But it shocks me that even in the midst of COVID-19, when I am talking to folks in other parts of the city outside of my district who want to play a role in solutions and solving some of these inequities, particularly in this moment in time because of what they're seeing nationally, that they still can't believe that folks have limited access to education. I live in Mattapan with my two boys. They are shocked that, what do you mean 5% access to a good quality school in Boston compared to downtown neighborhoods where it's 80% access? What do you mean? This wealth gap is real. They look at business. I'm like, yes, it's real. Come see. Right. And so there's something that is critically important. And, that's Brian Stevenson's language of what it means to get proximate, not just through us and our stories, but to come and visit these communities, to have a deeper understanding of what is happening there, in order to be an effective partner in solving those. And to come not with judgment or your own narrative or some deficit analysis of these communities. So let me tell you, they are strong, they're resilient, they're courageous, and they work incredibly hard. They are essential workers that are keeping our economy going. in the midst of this pandemic, right? The early ed childcare providers, I mean, they are Latinx women, Black women, right? The folks who are stepping up to keep us all moving. And so this idea of being proximate, I think, is really critically important for all of us to form solutions and ideas and to change those numbers and not to continue to perpetuate inequities. But I think it's also important that people come to see, to have a deeper understanding that what we're saying is not perception, that it is a reality for many in the city of Boston, and that in a way, in order to be effective in solving for these issues, you have to sort of get out of your comfort zone, get out of your pocket in the city, to come and realize what is happening in other neighborhoods. And then, of course, we can roll up our sleeves working in partnership with our civic leaders on the ground across the city of Boston, organizations, you name it, who have been doing this work for a really long time, to make sure that everyone has access to the same opportunities that others do in other parts of the city of Boston. But I don't think you do that well unless you get proximate.
And I think that is right. I take that issue about proximity, and I would also extend it to the media, because as somebody who has worked for Boston news organizations for going on 20 years, when I started as a reporter there, I spent far more time in Milton than I did just a stone's throw away in Mattapan, because that was the focus. And I realized very quickly that that was part of the problem, is when we have to be proximate to the people too. And I think that is something that I push forward to in my own in my own industry.
Narrative shift, which I think all of us will speak to in terms of the media portraying certain neighborhoods only through the lens of violence, only through the lens of poverty, trauma. No, we are more than that, right? In the conditions in which these neighborhoods sit, didn't happen by accident, weren't created by all of the individuals there. And so the media plays a big role in that. And that's why that's why we love you, Kimberly.
I
want to get to a couple more.
Can I build on this a little bit, Kimberly, before you move?
Please.
I'll try to move to something. Gosh, I have so many thoughts. Okay, so the first thing I want to bring into this space is a conversation that I had with a sister friend of mine, Brittany P., a scholar and an analyst. And, she was just saying that one of the reasons why we have this scarcity mindset when it comes to resources and power is because we do think it is something that is finite and that it is limited. And so for that reason, we don't understand that actually, like, power is it's not finite, it's infinite. It's all around us because we all have it inside of us. Okay. And that's not just some spiritual thing. It's quite literally true, right? But when we talk about the dismantling of structures, I want to say this: Black Boston cannot be the only people that care about Black Boston. And I think we've been giving folks a pass. So like Rashad Robinson from Color of Change often says, like, racial justice is not charity, it's strategy. So if you care about an equitable opportunity for social and economic mobility, then you will not shrink and be afraid to say, there is no business community if there isn't a Black business community. You will not be worried about if that's going to make someone uncomfortable, because, it's true. And so I remember being a city councilor, and anytime that we would see an uptick in gun violence, our constituents would only call the Black councilors and say, what are you doing? You have 4 at-large councilors. You have a mayor and a governor. You have civic leaders at every level of this. Hold you accountable, hold me accountable, hold all of us accountable. And so that's what I want. I want to feel seen. I want to be named. These policies that created the marginalization of our communities, they were not vague, Kimberly.
Right.
They were precise. Yeah. These disparities were not naturally occurring. So this is as much about the need for political will and courage as it is about people operating with a deficit and being complicit. Those philanthropists, you want to know what you can do? Start at home. What's equity look like? What's your board look like? What's your leadership structure look like? And what are they getting paid? Start there. Be a model. But I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge it, like Black Boston, this is about buy-in from other folks who are accountable to us, being actively anti-racist. and being unapologetic in the dismantling.
And that's such an important point. And it's also Black Boston aren't the folks who created the system that Black Boston keeps being asked to fix. I'm gonna.
Hey, we can fix it. I will also say, give it.
But
to
I just
us.
want to get one more question in because we only have a couple minutes left. And
you don't want the conviction. And I also want to say that the fight just can't be about representation. Because if that person brings no righteousness to the table, it doesn't matter.
Correct. No, that's absolutely right. All right, I'm going to ask you guys one last question while we have 2 minutes left. Boston has a lot of college students. College is what brought me to Boston. Boston University brought me to Boston from Michigan. And there's a question about what concrete things that folks who are here for college can do. I will add another question as to how I consider myself a part of Black Boston. How do you retain people of color? Because there were a lot of talented people in my class at BU, and the vast majority of them went somewhere else. So how do you engage college students, and how do you convince them that Boston is a place for them?
Well, I think college students, like anyone else, right, that we were just talking about, whether it's philanthropy or anyone else, we always need assistance in the work, whether it is the policy front, lending your expertise, your talent. Wherever you live in the city of Boston, there is a civic organization run by some fabulous resident leader who's been volunteering for a really long time. Many are led by elders in the community who are always looking for youth and younger participation, and they usually name that. Get involved at the local level. It's a great place to make change. I think, yes, let's get that president out, right? Let's vote in November, do your census. But at the local level, civic associations, policy, getting involved with campaigns, there's a lot to do in that front. And on that Black Boston piece, I take tremendous pride in being from here, but also pain and recognize that perception of us being an unwelcoming city, a racist city, is real for many, and we have to name that. And have honest and authentic conversations about that. Yes, Boston is wonderful. It's great. I love my city. But there's also this piece that we can't shy away from. So I think that's where we start, Kimberly, with respect to that piece of keeping people here.
Congresswoman?
So I associate myself with those comments, and I would just say that, whether people like to boast about who we attract to this city, I'm even more committed to how we retain homegrown talent, and we don't have the brain drain of those who were born and raised in this city. And for those that we are attracting here, who are transplants like myself, this is why I pushed for liquor license reform in restaurants and things that, create safe spaces and culture and community. In order for someone to be able to want to make roots someplace, it has to feel safe. And so all those parts do work together. And I would just echo what Councilor Campbell said. Step outside of your campus. That certainly is what changed my life. I attended Boston University, but when I made the decision to connect to the community around me, and not just to be conjecturing about things in a classroom, but to get into community, to pursue that internship, that is what changed the trajectory of my life and my public service contributions. So, and consider changing your voter registration. Vote here.
and
Representative Eligardo, you get the last word, Representative.
This is to all young people, whether you have the opportunity to be in college, you are currently unemployed, you are working in trades or another job, taking care of your family, whatever you're doing, young people have the power to shift the narrative in a way that none of us can. You can do it in all three ways. You can do it online, through writing. You can do it by your own model. And importantly, you can do it by showing up and mobilizing our communities. Use the time that you have to be in communities, shaping a narrative where, as has been said, justice is not charity. Justice is an investment in the future that we want. And the people that are currently under the greatest weight of oppression, because all of us are oppressed by oppression, including the people benefiting the most by it. But the people who are under the weight of oppression, they have strength and power and leadership. So you show up in those communities and unlock their leadership. Join up with what they are doing. And I'm a big fan of starting with public and affordable housing developments as a place to go, where you will have 3 and 4 and 5 generations of people of color that have been holding it down. And those communities have been robbed from us.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we've been taught to see it because somebody came in after some great grandmother invested for 5 decades, invested in a community, money, time, sweat, culture, love,
That's
dedication. Right. Somebody comes and drops $1, $1,000, $10,000, and it now belongs to them. Especially with respect to public property and public goods, we should say no to that. And college students can shape that narrative because before you know it, you're not a college student. You are in a space of open, public, recognized leadership. And so you need to be honing your abilities to walk the talk now. Get out there, and for every hour you spend in class, I did this. As a result, I got an F and a D as well as an A and a B and a few different things, but it was worth it to me. Spend every hour that you spend in class, spend an hour in the community.
Thank you.
And
Thank
if you
you
do that work,
that's
you'll
great.
transform.
That's
Your
great.
parents won't like it though, because your grades won't be quite as good.
It's great advice.
Listen, I wish this were a weekly series because I hate that our time is up. This has been such a wonderful conversation, and I thank all of you, Andrea Campbell, Nika Eliagardo, and Ayanna Pressley, so much for engaging in this conversation with us today. It's so important.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
And I also thank our audience. And just a reminder, the last installment of Black Boston, the discussion series from WBUR CitySpace and Boston University Initiative on Cities and Boston University Diversity and Inclusion will be held on October 13th at 5 p.m. We'll be talking about the Boston art scene with Crystal Williams, Vice President and Associate Provost for Community and Inclusion at Boston University, Makiba McCreary, Chief of Learning and Community Engagement at the Museum of Fine Arts, and Catherine T. Morris, founder and executive producer at Boston Arts and Music Soul Festival, and Maurice Emmanuel Parent, executive director of Front Porch Arts Collective. So you can find out more and register at wbur.org/cityspace. Have a wonderful evening.
Very nice.